200 miles off the French coast of Brest, on a summer afternoon in 1943, a man who had spent his entire career healing people suddenly found himself responsible for keeping 53 men alive in circumstances he had never imagined. Marine Stabsarzt Dr. Paul Pfaffinger had joined the Kriegsmarine to practice medicine, not to fight battles. His knowledge of naval combat tactics could fit on a prescription pad. Yet there he stood on the conning tower of U-441, watching 3 Royal Air Force Beaufighters emerge from the haze like vengeful angels, their wing-mounted cannons already chattering death toward his position. The date was July 12th. The attack lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though those who survived would remember it as an eternity compressed into heartbeats. Pfaffinger watched his commanding officer, Kapitänleutnant Klaus Hartmann, struck down by hot metal fragments, crimson spreading across the grey steel deck plates. Around him, men were falling. The experienced bridge watch, the officers who knew how to fight a submarine, the veterans who could have ordered the emergency dive that might have saved them, all were being cut down by that merciless fire from above. No klaxon sounded. No order came to flood the ballast tanks and drive the boat beneath the protective sea. In those crucial seconds when action meant survival, there was only chaos and blood and the screaming of wounded men. When the Beaufighters finally climbed away, their ammunition exhausted, Pfaffinger took stock of what remained. 10 men dead, 13 wounded, including every officer aboard who might have assumed command. The submarine was crippled, leaking, barely controllable. And between their present position and the safety of a French port lay 200 miles of ocean patrolled by aircraft that could find them, could kill them, could end their voyage at any moment. What Pfaffinger accomplished in the next 31 hours would become legendary among U-boat survivors. But his emergency command represented more than one man's courage under fire. It symbolized the complete transformation of submarine warfare that had occurred in the preceding months, a shift so profound that it had converted the hunters of the Atlantic into hunted prey, stalked by an enemy they could not see until the moment of attack. The transformation had been swift, brutal, and nearly absolute. Consider the mathematics of survival. 4 months earlier, in February of 1943, German submarine commanders still possessed a reasonable expectation of detecting approaching aircraft with sufficient warning to escape. Their METOX radar receivers could pick up the emissions from Allied patrol aircraft, providing precious minutes to crash dive before the enemy arrived overhead. The doctrine was simple and effective. 4 lookouts maintained constant watch. Detection equipment monitored for radar signals. When danger appeared, whether spotted visually at extreme range or detected electronically, the submarine dove. The entire crew had practiced this maneuver until it became instinctive. From the first alarm to submergence took 20 to 30 seconds on a well-trained boat. Within 35 seconds, they could reach 25 meters depth, safely below the effective range of most aerial weapons. That comfortable margin of safety had evaporated by July. Aircraft appeared overhead without warning, their radar emissions invisible to German detection equipment, their approach masked by speed and altitude, until visual contact occurred at lethal range. The window between detection and destruction, once measured in minutes, had compressed to mere seconds. For U-boat crews, the interval between the first sighting of an enemy aircraft and the detonation of depth charges had become the slimmest possible margin between continued existence and violent death. The statistical record tells a story more devastating than any individual tragedy. During 1942, German submarines had achieved results that brought Britain's supply lines to the breaking point. They sank 1,094 merchant vessels, representing 7.8 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. This industrial-scale slaughter cost the Kriegsmarine only 87 submarines, an exchange ratio that favoured Germany so dramatically that British planners genuinely feared defeat. 1 more year of such losses, they calculated, and Britain would starve. 12 months later, everything had reversed. May 1943 alone saw the loss of 41 German submarines, while sinking only 34 merchant ships. The exchange ratio that had threatened to win Germany the war had inverted completely. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the mastermind behind Germany's submarine campaign, acknowledged reality on May 24, 1943, when he ordered his boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic. It was a concession of defeat, an admission that the weapon on which Germany had staked so much had been rendered obsolete. But what exactly had changed? How had the equation of naval warfare transformed so completely in such a short time? The answer lay in a technological race where victory was measured not in miles or tons, but in seconds. The Type 7 submarine, the workhorse of Germany's undersea fleet, represented mature technology refined through years of development. Its designers had created a vessel capable of diving from surface to safe depth in under half a minute when circumstances demanded speed. 35 seconds from the first opening of ballast tank vents to reaching 25 meters depth. These numbers had been proven repeatedly in trials and combat. The submarine possessed the physical capability to escape aerial attack. But physical capability meant nothing without warning. A submarine could dive in 20 seconds, but only if the crew knew they needed to dive. When Allied forces introduced centimetric radar in March 1943, they eliminated the warning entirely. These new radars operated at wavelengths completely outside the detection range of German equipment. Suddenly, patrol aircraft could track submarines from miles away, approach without alerting their targets, and attack before the Germans even knew aircraft were present. The escape mechanism that had saved hundreds of submarines became meaningless when there was no time to initiate the dive. The first hints of this technological revolution appeared in late summer of 1942. Oberleutnant zur See Hans-Joachim Hesse stood his watch aboard U-94 in Caribbean waters, maintaining the standard vigilance expected of bridge-watch officers. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. The submarine's METOX detector, that critical piece of French-made equipment that had become standard on all German boats, monitored continuously for Allied radar emissions. According to its silent testimony, they were alone on an empty ocean. Then Hesse heard engines. Not distant engines that might be investigated at leisure, but the immediate roar of an aircraft directly overhead. How had it gotten so close? Where was the radar warning that should have provided minutes of notice? The lookout's cry of alarm sent men scrambling for the hatches. Less than 15 seconds passed between first sighting and the order to crash dive. 15 seconds should have been sufficient. The crew was well trained, the boat in good condition. But 15 seconds proved inadequate when the enemy was already overhead. As U-94's conning tower disappeared beneath the surface, Lieutenant Gordon Fiss of American Patrol Squadron VP-92 released 4 depth charges, each weighing 650 pounds. The weapons bracketed the diving submarine perfectly, their underwater detonations crushing the pressure hull like an eggshell. U-94 went down with all hands, the first victim of a new type of warfare where the old margins of safety no longer applied. Fiss's after-action report contained 2 words that would define the nature of submarine warfare for the remainder of the conflict. Target attempted crash dive, but was too late. Too late. Those words would be repeated in hundreds of reports over the next 3 years, in English and German, describing encounters where submarines tried to employ their standard escape procedure only to discover that time itself had become their enemy. In the war's earlier years, U-boat commanders had operated with what seemed like generous safety margins. The standard doctrine called for maintaining constant vigilance through multiple lookouts, each responsible for scanning a specific sector of sky and sea. On clear days with good visibility, experienced lookouts could spot aircraft at ranges approaching 10 miles, providing 3 to 4 minutes of warning time. This comfortable buffer allowed for deliberate action rather than desperate reaction. Kapitän-Leutnant Werner Hartenstein, commanding U-156, demonstrated the effectiveness of these procedures throughout his operations in 1942. His war diary from September of that year records a typical encounter with enemy aircraft. At 14:25 hours, a lookout spotted an aircraft bearing 045 degrees, distance approximately 8 miles. The alarm sounded. The crew initiated their crash dive. By the time the first depth charges detonated, 90 seconds after the submarine passed beneath the surface, U-156 was well clear of danger. 90 seconds of margin after submergence represented luxury in the unforgiving arithmetic of naval warfare. That interval allowed the entire bridge watch to clear the tower in an orderly fashion. The diesel engines could be properly secured rather than emergency stopped. The boat could reach genuinely safe depth where even a lucky hit from above would cause minimal damage. Commanders operating with such comfortable margins could make calculated decisions rather than desperate gambles. The statistics from this period confirmed German confidence in their procedures and equipment. Between February and October 1942, submarines transiting the Bay of Biscay, that crucial corridor between French ports and the open Atlantic, completed 80% of their passages without coming under attack. Even among the 20% who were attacked, 90% successfully crash-dived to safety before weapons arrived. These were odds that experienced commanders could live with. The introduction of ASV, Mark II radar in early 1942, initially seemed manageable from the German perspective. This radar operated at 1.7-meter wavelength and could detect a surfaced submarine at ranges between 10 and 15 miles. The range advantage seemed threatening until German technical staff analyzed the system and developed the METOX receiver. This device could detect the radar emissions and, critically, could determine from the pulse pattern when aircraft had locked onto a specific target. The steady ping of tracking radar typically provided 2 to 3 minutes of warning before visual contact occurred, ample time for even a sluggish crew to get below. Squadron leader Humphrey de Vere Lee understood the fundamental problem Allied forces faced when hunting submarines at night. Radar could track targets out to useful ranges, but contact was lost at approximately 1 mile, precisely when visual identification became critical for attack. At night, in those last crucial minutes of approach, the submarine became invisible again. The crew would hear engines in the darkness, sound the alarm, and crash dive to safety while the aircraft circled uselessly overhead, unable to visually acquire its target for weapon release. Lee's solution demonstrated the elegant simplicity of effective military innovation. Install a 22 million candle power searchlight synchronized to activate precisely when radar contact failed. The aircraft would track its target using radar down to 1 mile. Then the searchlight would suddenly illuminate the scene, catching the submarine on the surface with nowhere to hide and no time to escape. The first operational test of the Lee light occurred on June 4, 1942, when squadron leader J.H. Greswell, flying a Wellington bomber of 172 Squadron, illuminated an Italian submarine, the Luigi Torelli, in the Bay of Biscay. Though the attack itself failed due to faulty depth charges, the psychological impact on submarine crews was immediate and profound. Darkness, that ancient ally of submarines since the first primitive submersibles, no longer guaranteed safety. The first successful Lee light attack came 1 month later. On July 5, 1942, Pilot Officer W. Howell of 502 Squadron caught U-502 on the surface. Kapitänleutnant Jürgen von Rosenstiel commanded that boat, an experienced officer who had survived numerous encounters with enemy aircraft. His training and instincts were excellent. But when that searchlight snapped on, painting his submarine in brilliant illumination against the dark sea, von Rosenstiel had less than 20 seconds from the moment of surprise to the impact of weapons. When U-502 was sunk 6 days later in a separate attack, recovered documents revealed the crew's shock at being attacked without warning in darkness, a circumstance they had believed impossible. The Lee light compressed reaction time dramatically by eliminating the natural concealment of darkness. A Wellington bomber approaching at 120 miles per hour would cover the 1-mile gap between radar failure and weapon release in just 30 seconds. Subtract the time required for crew reaction, for officers to process information and give orders, for men to respond and begin the diving sequence, and submarines had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds to get underwater. This was insufficient time to reach safe depth. Even a perfectly executed crash dive left the submarine vulnerable while transitioning through shallow depths. By early 1943, the British mounted Operation Enclose, deploying 131 aircraft equipped with Lee lights in coordinated patrols across the Bay of Biscay. Admiral Dönitz responded by reversing standard operating procedures. Since aircraft equipped with Lee lights made nighttime surface transit suicidal, he ordered boats to surface during daylight and submerge at night. But this merely shifted the vulnerability from one period to another without eliminating the fundamental problem. March 1943 marked the true turning point, though German commanders would not immediately recognize it as such. Allied forces introduced the ASV Mark III radar, a revolutionary system operating at 10-centimeter wavelength using cavity magnetron technology. This centimetric radar was completely invisible to German METOX equipment. U-boat crews began reporting attacks without any radar warning whatsoever. According to German scientists and intelligence officers, such attacks should have been impossible. Radar could not function at such short wavelengths, they insisted. The reports must be mistaken. Equipment must be failing. Crews must be incompetent. U-333 became one of the first documented victims on March 6, 1943, while crossing the Bay of Biscay on its return voyage to France. Kapitän-Leutnant Peter Kremer's official report sent shockwaves through U-boat headquarters when it arrived. No METOX warning had been received. Aircraft appeared directly overhead without detection. The crash dive was initiated while under fire. Several men were killed or wounded by strafing before the boat submerged. Within weeks, similar reports flooded in from across the Atlantic. U-boats were being caught on the surface in broad daylight, at night, in fog, in conditions where they should have been functionally invisible to any patrol aircraft. Commanders who had trusted their lives to their detection equipment were dying without warning. The comfortable margins that had allowed submarines to operate effectively were evaporating. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A B-24 Liberator bomber equipped with ASV Mark III could detect a surfaced submarine at 15 miles. Flying at 200 miles per hour, it could cover that distance in less than 5 minutes from detection to weapon release. Without any warning, without any indication that they were being tracked, the submarine's first knowledge of danger came when lookouts spotted the aircraft visually. At that point, they might have 5 seconds, perhaps 10 if fortune smiled, between sighting and impact. This interval was insufficient even to sound the diving alarm, much less to actually get below. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating and immediate. These were men who had relied absolutely on their technological systems for survival. They had trusted their METOX receivers the way a soldier trusts his armor. Now, suddenly, that trust had been shattered. The equipment they depended upon had become worse than useless because its silence provided false confidence. Some commanders began ordering random crash dives at irregular intervals, hoping to avoid being caught on the surface by pure chance. It was a desperate measure that consumed battery power at unsustainable rates while providing no real security. By May 1943, the Bay of Biscay had acquired a new name among submarine crews. They called it the Valley of Death. Submarines leaving French bases faced a gauntlet of aircraft equipped with centimetric radar that rendered German submarines blind, Lee lights that eliminated darkness as concealment, and new weapons that could kill with unprecedented efficiency. During April and May of 1943, 56 U-boats were lost in these waters. Some never made it out of sight of their home ports before being destroyed. The compression of warning time created tactical implications that extended far beyond individual survival. Submarines consumed battery power at rates their designers had never anticipated. Forced to crash dive repeatedly throughout each day and night, often without time to properly charge their batteries between emergencies, U-boats found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. A Type 7 submarine could maintain 7.3 knots speed while submerged for only 1 hour before exhausting its batteries completely. After that, it had to surface to recharge using diesel engines. But surfacing immediately invited attack, beginning the deadly cycle again. The introduction of the Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo added yet another dimension to this nightmare. These weapons could be dropped from as low as 200 feet altitude at speeds up to 120 knots. Once in the water, the 680-pound torpedo executed circular search patterns while listening for the 24 kHz acoustic signature produced by submarine propellers. The Fido achieved a 22% success rate compared to 9% for conventional depth charges. Between May 1943 and the war's conclusion, these weapons would sink 37 submarines and damage 18 more. Particularly terrifying was the Fido's ability to attack submarines that had successfully crash-dived beyond the effective range of conventional weapons. Even escape beneath the surface no longer guaranteed safety. German attempts to restore technological balance consistently arrived too late or proved inadequate. The Naxos radar detector, introduced in September 1943, could theoretically detect centimetric radar emissions. But its maximum detection range was only 5 to 8 kilometers, providing insufficient warning when aircraft approached at 300 kilometers per hour. Moreover, the Naxos device's delicate construction frequently failed under combat conditions, leaving crews with a piece of equipment they could not trust. The Schnorkel, adopted from captured Dutch submarine designs and deployed operationally in early 1944, offered a partial solution by allowing submarines to operate diesel engines while remaining submerged. But this innovation came with severe limitations that prevented it from truly solving the fundamental problem. Maximum speed while using the Schnorkel was reduced to 6 knots. The diesel exhaust created a visible plume that could be spotted from aircraft. Most critically, the noise generated by engines running in the confined space of the Schnorkel tube made acoustic detection of approaching aircraft impossible. Submarines using Schnorkels were deaf to air attack until visual contact occurred. In a fit of desperation that revealed how completely the technological balance had shifted, Admiral Dönitz issued an order on April 27, 1943, that U-boats should remain on the surface and fight it out with attacking aircraft rather than dive. Selected Type 7 submarines were converted into what were designated U-flak boats, equipped with enhanced anti-aircraft armament. U-441's experience on that July day demonstrated the complete futility of this approach. When 3 Beaufighters coordinated their attack, overwhelming the submarine's defences despite its enhanced weaponry, the result was catastrophic. 10 men died, 13 were wounded. Dr. Pfaffinger found himself commanding a vessel he barely understood, nursing it home through waters where death might arrive at any second. Initially, U-boat crews refused to accept that their technological advantage had completely vanished. When U-333 reported being attacked without radar warning in March, other commanders dismissed it as equipment failure or crew error. Professional pride and ingrained confidence in German technical superiority made it difficult to accept that the enemy had achieved such a dramatic breakthrough. The German scientific establishment's insistence that radar could not operate at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters reinforced this denial. Admiral Dönitz himself initially rejected reports of undetectable radar as impossible or exaggerated. His war diary entries from April 1943 reveal deep skepticism about crew reports, suggesting that men were making excuses for their own failures of vigilance. This denial at the highest levels of command proved costly. Commanders who should have been adapting their tactics to a new reality continued operating as if METOX provided adequate warning. U-175, U-192, and U-273 were all lost in April 1943, while their crews maintained confidence in detection equipment that had become obsolete. As losses mounted through spring and summer, even the most optimistic commanders could no longer deny reality. The order to fight aircraft on the surface represented a fundamental break with decades of submarine doctrine, an acknowledgement that the traditional dive-to-escape response no longer worked. But surface combat proved equally futile, as U-441's conversion to anti-aircraft configuration demonstrated. Multiple cannons and determined crews could not overcome the fundamental advantage held by aircraft attacking with surprise and overwhelming firepower. By autumn 1943, even the most successful commanders accepted that the technological battle had been definitively lost. The introduction of American escort carriers meant continuous air patrols even in mid-Atlantic, eliminating the geographical sanctuaries where submarines had once operated with relative safety. Kapitänleutnant Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders with over 200,000 tons of enemy shipping sunk, addressed this reality in his final patrol report with characteristic bluntness. "The enemy can see us when we cannot see him," Luth wrote. "He can attack without warning. Our survival now depends not on equipment or tactics, but on luck alone." The psychological shift was complete and permanent. U-boat crews who had once sailed confidently from port, singing songs of inevitable victory, now viewed each patrol as a probable death sentence. The 7 in 10 casualty rate among submarine crews was not abstract knowledge, but lived reality. Everyone knew men who had failed to return. Everyone could calculate their own statistical likelihood of survival. Yet they continued to sail, continued to fight because orders were orders and duty was duty, and there was nowhere else to go. Understanding how completely the situation had reversed requires examining the mechanical reality of a crash dive. This was not a simple matter of opening valves and sliding beneath the surface. It was a precisely choreographed emergency maneuver where every second counted and every action had to occur in proper sequence. The sequence began when the bridge watch spotted danger and initiated the alarm. The electric klaxon that sounded throughout the boat sent every crew member racing to their diving stations. The bridge watch personnel had 12 seconds at most to clear the conning tower, sliding down the ladder in specific order based on their positions. The last man down had to secure the hatch behind him, dogging it tight against the pressure that would build as the submarine descended. Simultaneously, control room operators opened the main ballast tank vents, allowing water to flood into the tanks and push out the air that provided buoyancy. The negative tank, a 70-ton auxiliary tank positioned forward, was flooded to add weight to the bow. Bow planes were set to maximum down angle, 30 degrees if conditions permitted. All available crew members not at essential stations ran forward, using their body weight to help drive the bow down faster. The entire evolution required split-second timing and perfect coordination. If the angle became too steep, battery acid would spill from the cells, mixing with seawater to create deadly chlorine gas. If the angle was too shallow, the submarine would descend too slowly, remaining vulnerable to depth charges that would crush the hull. If any valve malfunctioned, any crew member hesitated, any piece of equipment failed, the submarine could be caught in that vulnerable transition between surface and safe depth where it had no protection. American patrol aircraft exploited every vulnerability in this process. The ASV Mark III radar operated at 9.1 GHz frequency with a wavelength of 3.2 centimeters, making it completely invisible to German detection equipment operating at longer wavelengths. Detection range in calm seas reached 15 miles, giving aircraft crews enormous tactical advantage. The Lee light produced 50 million candle power when triggered, automatically activating when radar range decreased to 1 mile. This combination gave submarines less than 25 seconds from illumination to weapons impact, insufficient time to complete a crash dive under any circumstances. The attack on U-758 on June 8, 1943, demonstrated the new reality with brutal clarity. After reporting the position of convoy Gers 9 south of the Azores, U-758 came under immediate attack from aircraft launched from USS Bogue. The submarine remained on the surface for over 30 minutes under continuous assault. Crew members manned anti-aircraft guns, while others prepared for emergency dive. Only when overwhelming force arrived did they finally submerge. 7 wounded men forced the boat's return to base without completing its patrol. The commander's report noted that remaining on the surface had only been possible because initial attacks were poorly coordinated, allowing anti-aircraft fire to disrupt bombing runs. On October 20, 1943, U-256 came under attack from aircraft launched from USS Block Island. After an unsuccessful crash dive attempt, Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Brauel was killed and several crew members wounded. The submarine's war diary recorded the crew's shock at being caught without any warning despite having functioning detection equipment. This pattern repeated across dozens of engagements. Submarines with operational METOX receivers and alert lookouts were being destroyed because the radar tracking them operated at wavelengths their equipment could not detect. The mutual destruction of U-571 and an Australian Sunderland on January 28, 1944, illustrated just how compressed the time frame had become. Flight Lieutenant R.D. Lucas detected U-571 on radar at 12 miles range. He achieved complete surprise by approaching through cloud cover, emerging at only 800 yards distance. This gave U-571 approximately 18 seconds before weapon release. As the submarine's conning tower disappeared beneath the surface, the Sunderland's port wing struck the submarine's jumping wire, the cable strung between periscopes to deflect obstacles. Both vessels were lost with heavy casualties. 52 men from U-571 perished. 11 crew members from the Sunderland died. It was a Pyrrhic victory that illustrated how technological advantage could be maintained even at the cost of the attacker's destruction. The decisive turning point came during what submarine veterans would remember as Black May of 1943. The Kriegsmarine lost 41 submarines in a single month. The battle around convoy ONS-5 demonstrated the utter impossibility of successful operations under the new conditions. Between May 4th and 6th, 17 U-boats attacked this convoy in coordinated Wolfpack tactics. 6 submarines were sunk. 11 were damaged, some so severely they could barely limp back to port. And despite this massive concentration of force, despite the sacrifice of so many boats and men, not a single merchant ship was lost. The statistics from this battle revealed complete reversal of earlier conditions. Average warning time before air attack had fallen to 8 seconds. Only 31% of attempted crash dives succeeded in getting the submarine below before weapons arrived. Not one U-boat managed to execute a successful torpedo attack against the merchant vessels they were supposed to be hunting. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunt had become a massacre. Admiral Dönitz's diary entry for May 24, 1943, conceded defeat with stark honesty. The enemy's new location devices and weapons have torn our sole offensive weapon from our hands, he wrote. The submarine war must be withdrawn until new weapons restore the balance. But those new weapons would never arrive. German technology could not catch up to the Allied lead. The war would continue for 2 more years, but the submarine force would never again threaten Allied supply lines as it had in 1942. U-boat operations after May 1943 became exercises in survival rather than offensive warfare. Boats remained submerged for up to 20 hours daily, surfacing only briefly to ventilate compartments and charge batteries. Even these brief surface periods, conducted at night with maximum vigilance, invited immediate attack. Submarines that had once proudly hunted across vast expanses of ocean now crept through it underwater, blind and slow and vulnerable. The introduction of the Schnorkel in 1944 eliminated the absolute need for full surface operations, but created new vulnerabilities that partially offset its benefits. The device required precise depth control. Too deep and the automatic valve closed to prevent water entry, creating a vacuum inside the submarine that could rupture eardrums and cause severe pain. Too shallow, and the schnorkel head created a visible wake detectable from miles away by aircraft lookouts. The visibility problem was particularly severe in calm seas, where the wake stood out clearly against smooth water. Statistics from 1944 reveal how completely the nature of submarine operations had been transformed. Average time on surface per day fell to 45 minutes, down from 16 hours in 1942. Average patrol speed dropped to 4 knots, down from 10 knots when boats could safely surface and run on diesel engines. Most telling of all, the exchange ratio of merchant ships sunk per U-boat lost fell to 0.7, compared to 12.6 in 1942. Germany was losing submarines faster than they were sinking enemy vessels, an unsustainable equation that meant the submarine force was effectively destroying itself with no corresponding benefit. The compression of the crash-dive window had strategic implications that extended far beyond individual losses or tactical defeats. U-boats could no longer coordinate wolf-pack attacks that required multiple submarines to maintain contact with convoys over extended periods. Commerce raiding became impossible when submarines spent most of their time submerged at minimal speed. The entire strategic concept that had nearly won Germany the Battle of the Atlantic had been rendered obsolete by technological change that measured its impact in seconds. American patrol squadrons evolved from amateur submarine hunters into efficient killers through systematic training and continuous technological advancement. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida, crews practiced attacks on actual submarines operating under realistic conditions. Every mock attack was filmed and critiqued in detail. Crews that took more than 35 seconds from sighting to weapon release failed the exercise and repeated it until they met the standard. This systematic approach to training created crews who could execute attacks with machine-like precision. By late 1943, American patrol squadrons achieved 1 U-boat kill for approximately every 40 attack sorties, compared to 1 kill per 200 sorties in 1942. This 5-fold improvement in efficiency resulted from better training, improved equipment, and accumulated tactical experience. The introduction of escort carriers brought air power to mid-ocean areas that land-based aircraft could not reach. USS Bogue's Air Group alone sank 13 submarines in 2 years of operations. These small carriers proved that air power could be projected anywhere in the Atlantic, eliminating the geographical sanctuaries where U-boats had once operated with relative safety. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hopgood, who helped establish American anti-submarine doctrine, described the evolution in stark terms. "We learned to think in seconds, not minutes," he explained in a post-war interview. "Every procedure was refined to shave time from our approach. We knew the Germans needed at least 20 seconds to crash dive. Our job was to deny them those seconds. The systematic approach to denying submarines their escape window represented warfare reduced to its most basic mathematical element. Measure the time required for the enemy to escape. Develop tactics and technology to compress that time below the survivable threshold. Execute those tactics with relentless consistency until the enemy is destroyed." VPB-110 became the first American squadron to employ Lee lights operationally in the Pacific Theater on January 10, 1945. They perfected a psychological warfare technique called the false engine approach. During the final run, they would throttle back their engines to create the illusion of greater distance, then suddenly increase power for the final attack. This technique proved devastatingly effective against submarine crews already traumatized by months of attacks without warning. The sudden roar of engines at close range often caused panic that delayed crash dive procedures by critical seconds. Ultra-intelligence from Enigma decryption fundamentally altered the mathematics of U-boat survival in ways that extended beyond any single technological innovation. The initial breakthrough in reading the German naval cipher occurred in June 1941, providing Allied forces with unprecedented insight into German submarine operations. This advantage was temporarily lost when the Kriegsmarine introduced a 4-rotor Enigma machine for submarine communications in February 1942, creating the Shark cipher that resisted British code-breaking efforts. The restoration of Allied code-breaking capability came at terrible cost. On October 30, 1942, HMS Petard depth-charged U-559 in the Mediterranean, forcing it to surface with crew abandoning ship. Lieutenant Francis Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier from Petard boarded the sinking submarine to recover codebooks and cipher equipment. Both men drowned when the submarine suddenly sank beneath them. Their sacrifice was not in vain. The recovered materials allowed British cryptographers to break back into the Shark cipher by December 1942, restoring the intelligence advantage that had been lost. The statistics reveal Ultra's devastating impact on submarine operations. 73% of U-boats were intercepted while transiting to patrol areas when Ultra intelligence was available, compared to 21% without such intelligence. Average time from a submarine's position report to air attack fell to 4 hours when its location was known through decryption. Allied convoys were successfully routed around German wolf packs 67% of the time based on decrypted movement orders. This intelligence advantage meant that even perfect crash dives only postponed inevitable destruction. A submarine forced to surface hours later to recharge batteries would simply be attacked again, because Allied forces knew where it was and where it would go. The combination of technological superiority and intelligence penetration created a situation where German submarines operated blind while their enemies could see everything. The complete reversal becomes clear when comparing operational statistics across the war's progression. In 1942, with German advantage firmly established, 250 U-boats operated offensively. They sank 1,094 Allied merchant ships. 87 submarines were lost. The exchange ratio of 12.6 merchant ships sunk per U-boat lost represented a German victory that threatened Allied survival. Average warning time before air attack was 180 seconds. Successful crash dives occurred 89% of the time. These were conditions under which submarines could operate effectively and survive. By 1943, the turning point year, 425 U-boats were operational, representing a massive increase in force size. Yet they sank only 363 merchant ships while losing 258 submarines themselves. The exchange ratio had collapsed to 1.4 merchant ships per U-boat lost, an unsustainable rate that meant the submarine force was effectively destroying itself. Average warning time before air attack fell to 15 seconds. Successful crash dives occurred only 37% of the time. German submarines were being slaughtered. In 1944, conditions deteriorated further. Despite having 436 submarines operational, the Kriegsmarine sank only 132 merchant vessels while losing 242 boats. The exchange ratio had fallen below 1-to-1. Germany was losing submarines faster than they were sinking enemy ships. Average warning time before air attack reached essentially zero. Successful crash dives occurred only 18% of the time. The submarine force had ceased to exist as an effective weapon. The human cost of this technological transformation was staggering. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in the German U-boat force during World War II, 28,000 perished at sea. That represents a casualty rate of 72%, among the highest of any military service in any nation during the war. These men died because the technological advantage they depended upon for survival was taken away through systematic Allied innovation. Those who survived carried psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. Many U-boat veterans suffered what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though no such diagnosis existed at the time. They experienced recurring nightmares of aircraft attacks, of diving alarms, of depth charges exploding around their helpless submarine. Some would start violently at sudden noises for the rest of their lives, their nervous systems permanently calibrated to react to threats that existed only in memory. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, who commanded U-96 through the brutal years of 1941 and 1942, survived the war and tried to build a normal life afterward. In a 1978 interview, he described the psychological aftermath. "For years after the war ended, I would wake at night hearing the diving alarm," he said. "My body would tense, preparing to run forward and add my weight to the dive. Then I would remember I was in my bed in Hamburg, safe, and the alarm existed only in my mind. But the fear was real. The fear never left." Many veterans struggled to explain their experiences to families who had not lived through the particular hell of submarine warfare. How could you describe to someone the absolute terror of hearing aircraft engines overhead when you knew your detection equipment was useless? How could you convey the helplessness of being trapped in a steel tube while depth charges exploded around you? The isolation of the submarine experience, the inability to flee or surrender or seek help, created trauma that defied description. Reinhard Hardigan, who commanded U-123 during spectacularly successful operations off the American coast in early 1942, found that his wartime achievements meant nothing in the face of post-war reality. "We went from being hunters to hunted in mere months," he reflected at a reunion of U-boat veterans in 1985. "The technology that had protected us, that to disappear beneath the waves in seconds, was taken away. When those seconds were gone, we were simply targets waiting to be destroyed. No amount of courage or skill could compensate for that fundamental loss." Peter Kremer, who survived the war after commanding several submarines, including U-333, wrote in his memoirs about the psychological impact of technological obsolescence. "We had trained for years," he noted. "We had practiced every emergency procedure until we could execute them perfectly. We had confidence in our boats, in our crews, in our equipment. Then suddenly, none of it mattered. Aircraft appeared overhead without warning. Our radar detectors were silent. Our lookouts saw nothing until it was too late. We died not because we were incompetent or cowardly, but because the enemy had developed technology that made our defences irrelevant." Dr. Paul Faffinger, whose emergency command of U-441 on July 12, 1943, saved most of his crew, became a respected physician in Hamburg after the war. In a 1976 interview conducted for a German television documentary about submarine warfare, he reflected on that desperate day. "I saved more lives in those 31 hours getting the boat home than in my entire medical career," he said. "We had perhaps 5 seconds warning when those Beaufighters attacked. 5 seconds between life and death. I sometimes wonder if those 5 seconds were luck or if some lookout was extraordinarily alert. Either way, 5 seconds was all that stood between survival and destruction." The reunion of U-boat veterans in Munich in 1985 brought together survivors from across Germany, men who had shared experiences that few others could understand. They spoke of lost comrades, of boats that never returned, of the strange guilt that came from surviving when so many had died. They discussed how the war had transformed from a contest they believed they could win into a technological nightmare where death arrived without warning and survival depended more on chance than skill. The lessons of the U-boat experience extend far beyond historical interest. Modern military planners study this technological transformation as a case study in how quickly dominance can be lost. Current military systems depend on technological margins as narrow as those crucial seconds that meant life or death for submarine crews. Stealth aircraft rely on radar-absorbing materials and designs to remain invisible to enemy detection. But stealth represents a temporary advantage, just as the U-boat's ability to crash dive represented temporary advantage. Any system dependent on a narrow margin for survival faces the same fundamental vulnerability that destroyed the German submarine force: Contemporary submarines, though far more sophisticated than their World War II predecessors, face their own technological threats. Satellite surveillance continues to improve, offering the possibility of detecting submarines even when submerged through various methods. Autonomous underwater vehicles could patrol choke points and transit routes, waiting to detect and track submarines. Advances in signal processing and sensor technology might make the oceans increasingly transparent, eliminating the concealment that submarines depend upon for survival. The fundamental lesson remains constant across technological generations and types of warfare. Technological advantages are temporary. Any system that depends on a narrow time margin for survival is inherently vulnerable to innovation that eliminates that margin. Military superiority based primarily on technology rather than on fundamental strategic or tactical advantages can evaporate with shocking speed when the enemy develops effective countermeasures. The last surviving Type 7 U-boat, designated U-995, now sits as a memorial at the Labeau Naval Memorial near Kiel, Germany. Visitors can walk through the cramped compartments where men once lived and fought and died. They can stand in the control room where officers ordered crash dives, in the cramped crew quarters where men slept between watches, on the deck where lookouts scanned for aircraft that could arrive without warning and destroy them in seconds. A plaque near the conning tower memorializes the 28,000 German submariners who perished at sea during World War II. The number represents not just individual deaths, but the complete destruction of a military force through technological obsolescence. These men died not because they lacked courage or skill, but because the narrow margin of time they depended upon for survival was systematically eliminated by enemy innovation. The story of the German U-boat's crash dive window represents one of military history's clearest demonstrations of how technology determines warfare outcomes. Between 1942 and 1943, Allied innovations compressed German reaction time from comfortable minutes to desperate seconds to nothing at all. When centimetric radar eliminated warning entirely in March 1943, the U-boat force effectively ceased to exist as an offensive weapon capable of threatening Allied supply lines. The human stories within this technological revolution illuminate the true cost of modern warfare. Dr. Paul Faffinger navigating a shattered submarine home after assuming emergency command he never trained for. Crews manning anti-aircraft guns against overwhelming air power because orders demanded they fight rather than dive. The mutual destruction of U-571 and its Australian attacker, where technological advantage was maintained even at the cost of the attacker's life. These moments reveal how technology transforms individual courage into statistical inevitability. Strategic implications extended far beyond individual encounters between submarines and aircraft. When the escape window closed completely, it took with it Germany's only realistic hope of strangling the Allied supply lines that sustained Britain and enabled the eventual invasion of Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Churchill identified as the dominating factor throughout the war, the one campaign that truly could have lost Britain the war, was decided not by seamanship or courage or tactical brilliance, but by the compression of time through technological advancement. U-boats entered the war with a reliable escape mechanism, the crash dive that could save them from aerial attack within a comfortable margin of safety. This tactical advantage shaped German naval strategy for the war's first years, enabling Wolfpack tactics that brought Britain to the brink of starvation by 1942. But the same scientific and industrial progress that had given submarines their underwater refuge methodically took it away through radar, lee lights, sonobuoys, acoustic torpedoes, and escort carriers that projected air power anywhere in the Atlantic. For the men who lived through this technological revolution, those disappearing seconds defined everything about their experience and survival. They had trusted their lives to a narrow margin of time, trained endlessly to exploit those seconds, depended absolutely on that buffer between detection and destruction. Then they watched that margin systematically vanish. In early 1942, they had minutes of warning before aircraft arrived. By mid-1943, they had seconds. By late 1944, They had nothing at all. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in laboratories and factories as much as on the ocean itself. British scientists who developed centimetric radar created a weapon more devastating to submarines than any depth charge. American workers who built thousands of patrol aircraft provided the platform to deliver that technology across millions of square miles of ocean. Allied intelligence officers who broke German codes eliminated the uncertainty that might have allowed submarines to evade concentrated air patrols. Together, these efforts collectively and methodically eliminated the U-boat's escape window. Their victory was methodical rather than dramatic, technological rather than heroic in the traditional sense. It emerged from systematic innovation and industrial capacity rather than from individual acts of extraordinary courage, though such acts certainly occurred. Yet the human element persisted even within this technological struggle. American air crews dropping life rafts to German survivors they had just depth-charged demonstrated that humanity could survive even in mechanized warfare. U-boat crews remaining at their posts despite hopeless odds showed that duty and courage transcended rational calculation of survival probability. The U-boat force that entered World War II as Germany's elite naval unit, confident in their technological superiority and ability to disappear beneath the waves whenever danger threatened, ended the war as a shattered remnant of its former strength. Of every 10 young men who sailed from French ports singing songs of inevitable victory in 1942, 7 would never return home. They died because technology stole the seconds they needed to survive, because their escape mechanism was rendered obsolete, because the margin of safety they trusted absolutely was eliminated by enemy innovation. Modern nuclear submarines never surface in hostile waters, making the crash dive effectively obsolete as a tactical maneuver. Yet these sophisticated vessels face their own technological vulnerabilities that may one day prove as devastating as centimetric radar was to their World War II predecessors. Satellite surveillance grows ever more capable. Underwater sensor networks become more sensitive and widespread. Autonomous vehicles offer the possibility of persistent tracking without risking human lives. These innovations may one day compress survival margins for submarines, just as radar and aircraft compressed those margins for U-boats between 1942 and 1945. The ghosts of U-boat crews who died believing they had seconds to spare, who trusted their detection equipment and their training and their to-crash dive to safety, serve as permanent warning to all who place absolute faith in technological advantages. In the brutal arithmetic of technological warfare, yesterday's comfortable safety margin becomes today's vulnerability, and today's decisive advantage transforms into tomorrow's fatal weakness with shocking speed. The final irony stands stark and undeniable. The most successful submarine force in naval history up to that point was destroyed not by superior seamanship, not by greater courage, not by tactical or strategic brilliance, but by the elimination of less than 1 minute of warning time. Those seconds, counted desperately by lookouts scanning the horizon, measured precisely by engineers calculating dive times, lost irrevocably to technological advancement, determined the fate of nations and the lives of tens of thousands of men. The story of the 45-second crash dive serves as eternal reminder that in warfare, as in all human endeavours, nothing remains permanent except change itself. The German submarine force learned this fundamental truth at terrible cost. 28,000 lives were lost when their margin of safety compressed from minutes to seconds to nothing. Their sacrifice stands as testament to an immutable reality of technological warfare. The seconds you count on today will not be available tomorrow, and the margin you trust absolutely will be eliminated by an enemy who thinks in terms of how to deny you that very margin you depend upon for survival.